Yeah.
Okay, well, I'd like to welcome you all to the AES October 2022 presentation. My name is Graham Huon, Chair of the Audio Engineering Society Melbourne Section. First, there's a little bit of housekeeping. For tonight's session, we'd appreciate keeping microphones muted unless identified to speak, and please use the chat feature to prompt us with any questions. That'll ensure we don't miss them. There'll be some time at the end of the session for general questions and discussions. Dolby Atmos has transitioned from its recognised role in film sound to a new and significantly different role as a dedicated platform for streaming music playback on platforms like Apple Music, Tidal and Amazon Plus. Tonight, Angus will take a broad look at the technical requirements for Dolby Atmos, including a description of his own studio, Red Road Immersive, and then offer some personal insights into what he feels are the important considerations in creating a good Dolby Atmos mix, especially for multiple music genre and in addition to movies. Tonight, we are very pleased to have Angus Davidson from Red Road Immersive, who's way up there in New Gisborne at the foothills of Mount Macedon here in Victoria, to provide what I understand will be a very interesting presentation. Angus has had over 45 years experience in the music industry as a studio designer, producer and studio and live engineer. Angus currently works in his 9.1.4 Dolby Atmos studio, Red Road Immersive, and is also Technical Director of Technical Support in APAC and North America for legendary Czech-based speaker manufacturer KV2 Audio. Please temporarily unmute your microphones and welcome Angus. That way you find your mute button. Very, very good. I'll hand over to Angus now, and I'm looking forward to tonight's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham, and thank you and Peter both for reaching out and asking me to be a part of this tonight. It's an interesting one, and one that I hope we'll all enjoy. So I'll get straight to it. I'm going to do a screen share here. It's going to be death by PowerPoint, I'm afraid, tonight, because one of the things about Dolby Atmos is that there's an enormous amount to know about it in a very short period of time. So I'm just going to try and pick the eyes out of it and look at what I've discovered in the relatively short period of time that I've been working with Dolby Atmos. So now, can you see that okay? Yep.
Yep, that's fine. Yep.
Jolly good. All right. Well, we'll get straight into it. I'll give you I'll keep these panels fairly quick because I don't want to belabor anything here. We're just going to look at this stuff pretty briefly, and I really think the value in this tonight is going to be gained in opening up the platform for people to discuss the Dolby Atmos platform and ask questions, and we can talk about things and just get a little more information about it. Because one thing that's absolutely true of this platform is that it's changing constantly, particularly as regards Apple Music's involvement, because we'll go into some more detail on that. But anyway, so you can see from that slide, I started back in the 70s working with bands, in particular Split Ends, and then live, and then built Sing Sing with Kai Dahlstrom, which was Australia's first live dead-end control room. I went on to work at AAV, Platinum, Alan Eaton, and a bunch of other Melbourne studios with all of the normal Melbourne and Australian artists you can see there. Moved to Los Angeles for a couple of years and worked mainly out of a studio in Santa Monica called Ground Control, and worked with some really fantastic artists and producers and engineers there during that time, which was a thrill. I ended up signing a publishing deal with Ross Wilson with Doodah Music. Ross lived just up the road from me when I was in St Kilda, and we ended up collaborating quite a bit. And I used to record a lot of his demos and things. And so he and I went on to work together with Paul Kelly, Tina Arena, Shireen from Big Pig, John Farnham, and a number of other people. I then for some reason, went back to live. I always enjoyed mixing live, and it was something that I think I was probably better at than I was at studio work. So I ended up working with a lot of great bands over the journey, including the ones you can see there. In between those times, I worked on a bunch of other projects. I did a lot of stuff working on designing studios for various people. Obviously, the Sing Sing one was a big job. And then I worked on a bunch of other ones, ended up getting out of the industry for a while and going to Tasman, becoming a fishing guide, taking people trout fishing. Then moved to Townsville and bought a restaurant, which was interesting. And then came back, ended up lecturing at Melbourne Polytechnic for doing audio for film, video and gaming. And then in between all these times, I worked with Avid as their director of live sound sales. And now I work with KV2 Audio, who are a fabulous speaker company who I'll talk a bit more about as we go on. But if I hadn't have worked for them, I probably would never work for another company again. I'm sort of done with that, but these guys are phenomenal. All right, so let's get started. So Dolby Atmos, one of the key things that you need to look at as an engineer producer is where you're going to work for a start, and if you're going to build your own place, which a lot of people are doing, and particularly as my studio was a lockdown project during COVID, there's a lot of people all over the world. A lot of guys in America who work at Capitol, Steve Genowick, and a bunch of different guys who ended up building their own temporary Atmos studios in their houses, and a lot of them continue to work out of those spaces because they got them to work. So how do we approach that? So I guess the first question is, what size room? If you're looking at near field, which is really only suitable for music or video, and by video I'm talking about something like Netflix or one of the streaming video services, you could look at a near field scenario. If you're looking at a midfield, I swap those two around. You can do that, probably more appropriate for video, but also useful for for music. So this studio that I'm in now here, Red Road Immersive, is what I would call on the largest size of, so it's in between sort of near and midfield. It's about 4.2 meters. It's almost square, unfortunately, and quite a low ceiling. But the way it's been treated, it works well. We'll have a look at that. So that's quite sort of what I would call midfield. We're looking at 2 to 3 meters from most of the speakers. And then obviously far field, which you're looking at film or video, you're looking more at a sound stage, a sound firm type or dub stage, or one of those larger rooms where they'll obviously have a much more comprehensive array of speakers and so on that suit that application. Sorry? Oh, I said someone yell out. Never mind. We'll carry on. So as I say, Red Road Immersive is what I would call a midfield size studio. The treatment is really crucial. As I said, this studio is pretty much a square. So based on my previous experience designing and building studios, I decided, because this was the only option I had without having to build a new space, that I would treat it pretty much with almost 100% absorption and very large traps in the corners to reduce the incidence of bass nodes and problems in the low frequency. Also, obviously, because you've got speakers coming from 14 different areas, having them going across the room and hitting a reflective surface can cause all sorts of problems. So I was very careful to reduce the reflective areas so that we'd only be getting really secondary reflections rather than primary reflections, which has worked really well. The room itself works quite well. So again, we're not going to go into too much detail there. We can certainly, I can talk to people about that, or if people got questions later, we can go into more detail. The other obvious question for someone building a studio is, do you want a mixing console or are you going to mix in the box? Well, you can see probably behind me well, maybe you can't actually. I'm running a 32 channel Avid D control, which is a lovely old dinosaur from the early days of control surfaces. Still a fantastic control surface, in my opinion. It controls pretty much every element of Pro Tools, which is the DAW that I'm using. I like faders, you know. In fact, I think I say that there. I like faders and knobs. I'm far more interested in being able to be tactile and work that way. It seems to be a lot quicker for me to do that, and I seem to get far better results intuitively by doing that as well. So equipment, again, in my opinion, absolutely the most important element of any studio, really, or any playback situation for that matter, is speakers. Now, as it's been made clear, I work for this company, but I wouldn't have done so unless I really believed in them. George Crampera, who founded this company over 20 years ago, has had an incredible career in speaker design. He worked for Mackie, he worked for RCF. He has had a hand in just about every major development of transducer design in the last 50 years. So transcoil, double silicon spiders for subwoofers. There's a whole range of stuff I won't bore you with now, but nitrate vapor deposition on high frequency compression driver diaphragms to reduce resonance and stiffen the diaphragm. Whole bunch of stuff that's made a huge difference in the way speakers behave generally for a lot of manufacturers, but in particular KV2 audio. So if we look at them very briefly, all analog, extremely low distortion, very high intelligibility and detail, super fast transient response, and not just the speakers, but the amplifiers that he matches to them. So all of the amplifiers that we use in KV2 have a faster than 1 microsecond response rise time and very fast settling time as well, and very wide dynamic range. So what I find in this application particularly, it might interest you to know that all the speakers in here are all designed for live sound, not for the studio. So they're not dedicated studio monitors. These are the kind of speakers you'd see often in an installation or on a stick on top of a sub at a gig at a local club or a hotel or what have you. We make speakers going from 6-inch or 5-inch speakers up to VHD5, which would cover 30 to 40,000 people. So, and everything in between. But I'd encourage you to have a look at them. If you're interested in building a studio, they're an extremely good speaker. Now, I'm just going to see if I can do this. I'm just going to show you at this point. Actually, no, I'm not. Sorry, we'll just go to the next part of the slide. So in Dolby Music Studios, the requirement is in SPL DBC weighted is 85 dB with minimum 20 dB of headroom. So you need to be able to generate 105 dB C weighted out of every speaker. So each independent speaker. We're not talking about an overall volume in the middle of the studio. We're talking about the SPL generated from each speaker. And what you'll find is a lot of studio monitors really struggle with that SPL, particularly in a large room. So when I looked at what we're going to look at now, which is, this is, can everyone see that? That's the Dolby Atmos Music Studio. It's called the DART. It's a Dolby Atmos room design tool. So it's based on an Excel spreadsheet. And what it allows you to do is input all your personal data and then basically put in the dimensions of your room. And by virtue of that, it will then give you the layout of your room relative to what you've input there. And then it gives you a whole lot of design parameters here, including the ability to be able to look at a range of speakers. So there's speakers by Adam, by Ascendo, ATC, Augsburger, Barefoot, Dynaudio, Eve. So all of the, Focal, and then Genelec, obviously, big players in the game, JBL, and then, of course, we've got KV2 here. So great tool if you want to figure out what speakers you want to select and what you need to be able to do. Now, if you look over to the right here, you'll see that it's got the headroom active speaker max peak SPL, and then max headroom above the target SPL. So what it's saying is it's looking at 135 dB of output of these particular speakers, peak output, which allows us 15.6 dB of headroom over the 105 dB goal. Now, while it doesn't actually add to that there, it's taking into consideration the distance from the speaker to the listening position in the center of the room. So anyway, this is something that I can make available, or a link to this if people are interested in looking at it more deeply. There's certainly a lot of great information on it. And also, if you look on the left here, there's links to a lot of the technical guidelines and Post and Music Pro support, which are really fantastic resources provided by Dolby, who are really very, very serious about their involvement in this platform and their engagement with people like me and studios like ours to ensure that we get really good, consistent results. So we'll go back to our little PowerPoint here. So again, looking at equipment, let's look at now, we're looking at speakers. So the LFE and sub. So LFE, which obviously low frequency effect, that comes really predominantly from the film world. So the LFE was included as a way of creating, really good, loud sub information, and predominantly information that was specific to a particular sound or effect that was being generated on the screen. So that application now in Dolby Atmos for video really fulfills very much the same thing. But with the advent of home Dolby Atmos, and particularly if you think about sound bars, companies like Sennheiser make what I consider the Ambio to be the best of those systems. I have a Sonos system which employs an LFE and surrounds and so on, and a sound bar that provides a Dolby Atmos soundscape. But the LFE and sub, the difference that we've got here is that the sub actually extends the range of the main speakers down to 40 hertz. So if we look at, for instance, at my room here, the speakers on the side, which are an EX6, which was 6-inch speaker and a horn, they go down to about 60. So in theory, all of these rooms need to be able to have their main speakers going down to 40 hertz. So the sub speakers that we utilize in these rooms are there for what they call bass management. So it's there to extend the main and surround speakers, if they don't go down to 40 hertz, to that 40 hertz target. And then the LFE, which is again being used to supplement and not as a sub source, is there as an effect speaker. Now, obviously in Dolby Atmos for music, we don't have the same type of a sub effect or low frequency effect that you'd expect to see in film. So a lot of people, and I'm one of them, from time to time uses that depending on the genre of music. But you will see as this presentation goes on that people, that the powers that be, particularly the big companies like Universal Music Group and Dolby themselves and some other players, have made fairly clear that they don't want the LFE to be treated as a sub. So you'll see that as we go on where that leads. So again, LFE, low frequency effect speaker, adds sub frequency to sounds as an effect rather than the full range signal. So use of the LFE channel can be considered for supportive elements of the mix, but not as a destination for all low frequency content. So you don't want to rely on it as your exclusive bass channel. And in fact, you'll find, as you'll see a bit later on, that they actually recommend that you listen without the LFE a lot, so that you can make sure that your balance without the LFE is good, that there's enough bass in the mix. We'll go into that in more detail. All right. Now, I'm not going to take questions right now unless, gentlemen, unless you think that there's a time when we should break or that you'd like to open it up. But I think probably we're going to be better off, looking at the chats down the track and then doing the questions at the end, if that's all right. I think that'll probably work a little better. Okay, now this will be really quickly. DAWs, I use Pro Tools. I use an Avid Matrix, which I think is probably the best interface I've ever used. I've also got HDIOs, all Avid based. Of course, Nuendo, Logic, Ableton. There's a whole bunch of extremely capable interfaces and DAWs out there that do an exceptionally good job at this same thing. I'm married to Pro Tools because I've used it for such a long time, and I've used it for a bunch of different stuff, not just for Dolby Atmos, but I use it for film and for mixing and mastering and all sorts of things. Now, computers, Apple for Dolby Atmos Production Suite, which is the one that I'm using, DAPS, and Apple or PC for the Dolby Atmos Mastering Suite. I'm not going to read much of this here because there's another page that goes into a bit more detail. A network, I'm using Cisco managed switches because I'm running Dante. So that Dante network runs through switches. It is, as far as I've found so far, absolutely bulletproof. And I love it to bits. Now, this is actually from the Dolby website, and it just shows here on the left-hand side, and that column extends to the next panel. The Dolby Atmos Mastering Suite is a multi-system workflow. It supports. Let me make it really easy. Actually, it does almost exactly the same thing as Dolby Atmos Production Suite, with the exception that if you look at on the right-hand side, you'll see where it says EQ and room calibration support and speaker array mode support. So the Dolby Atmos Mastering Suite has those two things which are not present in the Dolby Atmos Production Suite. Now, most people that use Dolby Atmos Production Suite do it all in one computer, and they use a thing called Dolby Atmos Bridge or Dolby Audio Bridge to facilitate that, which allows you to run the renderer, which you'll see in a moment, separately to the DAW, to the Pro Tools program, and send your audio backwards and forwards from Pro Tools to the renderer, and then from there to the outputs to your speakers to be able to monitor your Dolby Atmos. In fact, I'm running Dolby Atmos Production Suite, and with exactly the same as you would normally run Mastering Suite, with two computers through Dante, and it behaves itself absolutely perfectly. If I do need EQ and calibration, I do it all through the Matrix, which I believe is superior. The only thing I don't get is the speaker array support, which I don't need in this room because it's 914. So I'm not using multiple speakers in my surrounds that you would normally associate with a larger facility that's doing Dolby Atmos for film in particular. So I don't think we need to go into more detail on that. Again, we can talk about that further if people are interested. It's all fairly self-explanatory, but it is interesting that you can use exactly the same workflow with Production Suite as you do with Mastering Suite. It just ends up being a whole lot cheaper and works exactly the same way as far as I'm concerned. I get exactly the same results. Okay, moving on. So we're going to start looking just at a couple of things that are within the Dolby workflow. The first one is the Dolby Atmos Music Panel. Now, this is specifically useful for music production on the Dolby Atmos platform. It enables you to do a lot of the things that you can do in a normal Pro Tools stereo panel or surround panel, but it adds a couple of really clever things. One of which is down the bottom, you'll see that there's a sequencer, and that is really useful, particularly if you want to start creating tempo-based panning patterns, which it does very, very well. I can't read the right-hand side of that, so let me just have a quick look. Okay, so yeah, that's pretty self-explanatory. So it comes in AAX, it comes in Dolby Audio units or VST3. So it's basically, it works with any of the common Atmos DAWs that would be used in studios. And it does, as as I mentioned, it does allow you to sequence, use the sequencer for syncing objects to the DAW tempo. So if you've got someone that's written a song to a particular tempo that you want to be able to automate to, very simple to do that. It automatically looks at the tempo of the track and will synchronize to that, and it's able to do step durations from I think it's 2 bars all the way down to 64th beats. And this one you can see is only mono, but you can get them in stereo. It will instantiate in stereo as well, and you can have it so that it's either not looking at elevation or it is. So it'll work in X, Y, and Z dimensions of, so vertical and all of the surround dimensions. Okay. Now this is really an interesting part of what's happening in Dolby at the moment. The Dolby Atmos binaural settings plugin basically is also present in the Dolby Atmos render, which you'll see in the next slide. What it does, Dolby Atmos is basically 128 channels. The first 10 channels are a 712 bed, and you can see there from the numbers, 712 left, right, center, LFE, sides, rears, and then the tops, which is the 2. So obviously in my room I'm 914, so I've got front and rear height speakers, and then I'll be shortly going to 916, which will give me front, mid, and rear height speakers, as well as LCR, which is left, center, right, and then there'll be a wide, which is what makes up the 9 rather than a conventional 7. So a 712 is your left, center, right. It's your sides, rears, LFE, and your 2 height speakers. You can go obviously up to pretty much unlimited. Well, actually, I think 916 is about the. I think 916 is the maximum until you go into an arrayed Dolby Atmos where you've got obviously additional speakers, tops and sides. So this particular plugin is used to determine the binaural configuration of the bed, and then from 11 to 128 are objects, and those objects can be selected in your workstation and put onto a channel and then moved independently of that bed anywhere in the 3-dimensional space. So if, for instance, you've got a bird, and you want to have the bird moving around in that 3-dimensional space, you apply an object to that, and rather than it addressing the speakers, which is what happens with the bed, all of those 10 bed channels are addressing actual speakers. Each of those objects is then addressing a theoretical space, 3D space. And so you can have, as I say, from 11 to 128 can be objects, and those objects can be applied either mono or stereo to any channels in that Dolby Atmos field. Now, the difference between what we're looking at here and the conventional Atmos listening situation is obviously in a studio, you're listening to the speakers. In the case of this binaural settings plugin, what it does, it allows you, if you look at the second column, which says binaural setting, default for that is mid, but the 3 options are, well, there's 4 options actually: off, near, mid, and far. And what they do is create, if you like, it's a reverb for all intents and purposes. It creates an ambience that places that particular object or that element of the bed in either a near or off, which is no treatment whatsoever, near, which is feels very close, mid, slightly further away, or far, which is a more distant, more ambient sound attached to that particular object. Now, the reason they're there is because when you're running a binaural headphone-based mix, you obviously want to be able to optimize the depth of the field that you're placing these objects and the bed in relation to how you're hearing it binaurally. So let's see what this next one says. So when the plugin is connected to the renderer, you can use the plugin to modify input configuration and binaural render mode settings for either monitoring the mix, writing the plugin settings to a master, or copying the binaural render information from the settings from the plugin to the master. So there's a whole bunch more stuff we can do with this using the groups, but there's a lot to get through, so we'll leave that as it is for now. Now, I should mention the binaural. If you think about music and the way music is taken these days, 95% of it is listened to by kids with AirPods or headphones on, not in big studios or rooms with big multi-channel Dolby Atmos systems. So there's an increasing awareness of the fact that we need to be able to accommodate that and make these mixes really meaningful in a way that translates from how we hear them in a studio to a really meaningful experience in a binaural setting. So to that end, a number of things have happened. Firstly, and most significantly, I think, is Dolby have developed a custom or customizable HRTF function. So HRTF is head-related transfer function, and that essentially looks at the physiology of a person's head right down to the shape of their ears, to the distance between their ears and on the side of their head, the actual shape of their head. And a generic HRTF function has always been sort of the solution for creating a binaural sound for surround sound. Now, just recently, I was part of a beta testing program where Dolby created a phone app that allowed you to take a video of your head, a continuous video around your head, and from that they created, or the app creates an HRTF. So it creates a custom-made head-related transfer function that is you save as a file, and then you can load into the Dolby Atmos renderer, which is this little guy here, so that when you do select a binaural output from that renderer, you listen to it, it is customizing what you're hearing to the actual shape and dimensions of your head, which sounds like black magic, but it actually is very, very effective. So if you were to look up here, where can you see my cursor there? Anyone? Just nod, gentlemen. Yep. Okay. Thanks, Graham. Where my cursor is there on the newer version of this renderer, because I actually took this out of the Dolby support information. There's space here to be able to actually select your custom HRTF function, which, as I say, I think is very useful. So if we look at this, so as I say, this is the renderer we're looking at here. Now, if you were running a Dolby Atmos production suite, conventionally, this would be running on the same computer as your DAW, as your Pro Tools or Nuendo session. It's actually, I believe now, I don't use Nuendo. Probably if there's a Dolby guy here, they could probably confirm this or deny it. I believe that Nuendo now has the renderer built into the DAW, and I think Logic may be going the same way, which is the Apple platform. Anyway, regardless, the renderer, this is the business end of it. So once you've done all your mixing, you can see here on the left-hand side, you can see the first 10 channels there are your bed channels. So LCR, LFE, left and right sides, left and right rear, and then left and right top. And then you've got all of those other green ones that are lighting up, and some of them are yellow. These are the objects which have the information that's not going into the bed. Oops, sorry, I've done that. Okay, let's try that again. And you can see, looking here in the middle where where all the metering is, that it's showing there a 714. sorry, 714. So we've got left, right, center, LFE, left side, right side, left rear, right rear, and then left top front, left top right, left top front, left top rear, right top front, right top rear. Okay, so that's our 714. And then below that, you can see that's actually the room configuration for 714. Now, in my case, I've got 914, which means that down here, where you can see the cursor on both sides, there'd be a wide. Otherwise, it would be the same configuration. And then looking down to the bottom right, this is an interpretation of the 3D space showing all of the objects that are in play. And you can see on those objects that they have a number attached to them. And again, if this was, unfortunately, I wanted to show you all this, but my Pro Tools computer died a few days ago and I'm dead in the water, unfortunately. But this, normally you'd see these objects might be moving, they may be static, but then if they've been panned or if they've been physically moved with a panner and with automation, you'd see these objects moving around that 3D space. Now, if we go again to the top, you'll see we've got input and master. So right now, this is actually playing a master. Now, a master file can take a couple of formats. The most common one, which is what you would send off for ingest, the final product, is called an ADM. And that is a single file which has all of the multi-channel information embedded in it. And this is what would be playing here. And you can then see we've got this time code there. It's showing that it's a 24-bit recording, so on and so forth. And then you can also see to the right of the metering there, you've got a limiter and the binaural output, which is the left and right there. And then to the right of that, very, very important little area there is the loudness, which allows you to look at that either in the full Atmos or in stereo in order to monitor your loudness, which is, you'll find, is very, very important when it comes down to deliverables. Now, there's another unit here. There's a company I've been involved with for a couple of years called Arvis. It's a New Zealand company. They've created a thing called an H24D. Matthew Simmons, the guy that owns the company, very clever guy. He started Arvis when he was 13, I think, in 1983, and he's been building stuff ever since then. He's had a big impact in the film and video industry, creating all sorts of different codecs and things along the journey, a lot of which was picked up by Park Road Post in New Zealand, who obviously, they did all the Lord of the Rings stuff and a lot of great stuff through Peter Jackson. This is a really clever unit. This allows us to listen to Dolby Surround directly from the output of either an Apple 4K or something else that will output surround through HDMI, and it gives us it converts from 16 channels of HDMI to either AES EBU, Dante, Ravenna, analog, or HDMI stripped to video, so HDMI audio only. And it decodes all of those lovely things below there and will render Dolby Atmos and DTSX. So a really, really useful tool. Very difficult in a studio environment to take stuff that's already been put up onto Tidal or Apple Music and monitor that in the studio. So up until now, it had to be done through very large and expensive Atmos receivers that had analog outputs that you could then put into your speakers. In my situation, I'm using the Dante output, which goes straight into the Matrix, and I've just created a separate output for that. So it's a really fantastic solution for being able to monitor commercial output of, and it can be audio, it can be music, or it can be video. You can listen to Netflix or one of the other streaming services that is putting out Dolby Atmos. So a very good tool. Now streaming.
Angus,
yes,
Angus, we got feedback from Jim Barber, wherever Jim is. He said that Logic does have the renderer built in the chat session.
Yes, good. I haven't got that chat open, actually. Let me just, do you want me to do that?
Yeah, probably. If you want to jump out of the screen sharing for a minute or so and we can see your smiling face.
Oh, you don't want to see that. Trust
Yeah,
me.
we do.
Yes, Logic has. Thanks, Jim. Yep. The Dolby guys present are probably going to be turning their eyes up the way I'm describing all this, but it's just there's so much to get through. We're almost done here, so let me just go through this because we're getting close to the end of this, and I will get out of here for a minute once we've just got through these last few slides because it's worthy then I think of seeing some faces. Streaming is really interesting. It's reshaped the face of music over the last 10 years. Spotify has absolutely captured the marketplace. I think it's got an enormous percentage of the streaming market in the US. It's gone from 1.5 million to around 61 million between 2010, and this is going back to 2019. So it's going to be significantly more now, according to the Recording Industry Association of America. So, we're looking now at 80% of the US market compared to 7% in 2010. 2010 is streaming. So if you look at that breakdown, 7% in 10 years up to 80%. So it's just phenomenal. And it really speaks volumes as well, obviously, about, the difference now in what's happening between digital downloads and physical purchases through, CDs and DSDs and DVDs in those days to now where, physical is only 9%. And I'd wager that a significant amount of that now is going back to vinyl, because a lot of people are looking at vinyl these days. Now, interestingly, these are the streaming platforms around the world: Apple Music, Tidal, Amazon, all in the US. And then we've got Angami in Lebanese Arabic, Hungama in India, and Navavibe in South Korea. You notice Spotify's not there, even though it's far and away got the biggest market share of streaming downloads, or streaming, I should say, playback, because it doesn't do Dolby Atmos at this point, or any spatial platform. So kind of interesting. Now, I'll go through this quickly and we can revisit it if people want to look at it again. I'm just going to move this here. So now this is sort of a combination of some stuff from Netflix, which was a really big player in early sort of mid-sized studio use for Atmos. And then obviously there's a lot of this from sort of some Dolby stuff and also from Universal Music Group. But it's pretty much, I think, accepted as standard procedure for mixing for Dolby for music. So got to be mixed in an Atmos room with a minimum speaker config of 714. So that's your standard bed with 4 overheads. And mix should be also checked with a 5-1, 2 or 4 configuration. Now, again, I've got some slides I took out here, and the reason is because it's really going down the rabbit hole. But basically, Apple Spatial is not, strictly speaking, a straight Dolby Atmos platform or standard. It uses a different standard to, for instance, Tidal or Amazon, which is a straight Dolby Atmos implementation, and it uses a little bit of messing about that Apple likes to do themselves. I don't know why. Content creators like myself are incredibly frustrated by it, because Apple basically wouldn't tell us what they were doing for a long time. Suffice it to say that they have come around to a certain extent, particularly in relation to binaural, which originally in the platform they were using, there was no binaural information included in their metadata. So whatever you did in the binaural stuff that you could see in that previous slide, in order to prepare it for streaming, wasn't included in Apple's information. That is changing. I've had information in the last week that has changed. I can't tell you exactly how, but it is now being included to a certain degree. It will be available. So where are we? So mixers should be also monitored over headphones with a headphone render mode set to binaural. Headphone mixing only recommended where a room of the above configuration utilized for final checks. A lot of mix engineers like to start mixes on headphones. They find that it's a really useful way of getting the best sounding mix by starting in binaural and then moving through to the room. I do sometimes I don't. Depends very much for me on the genre of music and what people are, expect to hear. This is a near-field mix. The most common monitoring levels for near-field are 79 or 82 dB, SPL, LCS, slow, C-weighted. So all speakers set to the same reference level. So this is something that's a standard that's expected to be adhered to. And if you look at, say, Netflix, then you're looking at 82 to 84 dB. But that level is regarded as a good level for mixing for music. Now, if we were to go back and look at that renderer, you'd see where all of the metering was, that there was a standard or a level for you know what, I'm just going to go back to it quickly. So you see here on the right, it says integrated loudness, and that's sitting at minus 23.5. The maximum that can be at the end of a song is minus 18, right? And and the true peak maximum can be minus 1. So let's go back to where we were. Now these are standards that are pretty much respected industry wide now. Loudness shall not exceed minus 18 LKFS. It's not a target, but a maximum. So if you're out, for instance, you're recording, mixing an album, you might not have every song at minus 18. Your quiet songs might be minus 20 or minus 22. It's then becomes a creative decision based on how you want that album to roll out. Peaks can't be above minus 1 true peak. If you do go above these levels in volume, it's pretty likely it'll be rejected. Frame rate has to be set to 24 frames per second. Minimum sample rate is 48K, bit depth of 24. Only 48, 24 or 96, 24 sample rates are supported. But it's worth being aware of the fact that if you're they'll only currently stream at 48.24. So even if you mix in 96.24, you have to present the ADM file in 48.24. So you can archive at the native sample rate if it's recorded and mixed at 96K, but the ADM has to be downsampled to 48K. Default 10-channel bed configuration, the Dolby Atmos renderer should be retained, even if channels are unused. This is important for the encoding ingestion process. There is, we'll just go through here. So 5-on down mix settings should be set to direct render. This is a UMG requirement that I didn't use when we first started doing that. I do now, and I'm still, maybe one of the Dolby guys can tell me exactly why that is, because I'll be honest, I'm not 100% sure. All active beds and objects. I've just seen this. Oh, there we go. Interesting. All active beds and objects should be unmuted for the print session. Binaural metadata should be set for all bed and object elements. Utilize as many binaural parameters as possible. Utilizing only one can delay delivery. Utilizing off in isolation does not constitute a binaural parameter. So if you turned everything to off, you'll run into trouble getting it accepted. And they like your LFE to have a low pass in order to make sure that there's not full range information going through to that channel, because it obviously can overload the channel unnecessarily. Now this is from UMG, Universal Music Group. Pretty good sound, sensible advice. Make sure your room's tuned regularly. So we do that here. We always check our timing and tuning. I will say that because these speakers are so good and so clear and so fast, I've applied no EQ to this room. There are Dolby EQ curves, which they recommend, which in some recent conversations with people we've agreed are not appropriate for music for the most part. And so I find a lot of people are diverging away from that and treating their room more the way they would a conventional recording studio and mixing studio. That's, again, something that we may want to talk about within the group. If you're not working directly with the artist, please make sure you're matching the creative intent of the original mastered stereo version. This is another big conversation. It's a very, very contentious subject, and one where people typically will either say, I want it to sound exactly the same as the master, or you can do whatever you like, just make it sound interesting. We'll get onto that because there's a whole lot of reasons why you do both of those things at different times. I always keep a version of the stereo mix in the master session for timing, and also obviously because I do like to refer to it to make sure that the intent of the original song is being honoured and that we're keeping as close as possible, if that's the instruction from the artist or from the management. Super important to match the timing of the stereo master, particularly in order, if there's for some reason drops out of Atmos and it falls back to the stereo, you want to make sure that you're not running into problems with timing being different. So for that reason, the Dolby time code option is always utilized every time. Use the format to express the music in a meaningful way. Well, that's pretty obvious. The workflow can and does change to suit the respective genre or track, always, I find. If you listen to one of the first tracks done in Dolby Atmos, which was the Rocket Man Elton John track, his vocal is almost only in the middle track. They very quickly realized that people could extract that without any effects or any other music, which obviously created a big problem for artists who didn't want their vocals sampled and stuck into other tracks. It also, there's a lot of other reasons why these days you'll find, we'll get into that actually, but it doesn't work for a whole bunch of reasons. Having the vocal comes in the middle comes from film, where the dialogue was almost always in the middle track. And there was reasons for that. And in music, that reason doesn't stand up. So typically what we'll do now is not have it in the center track at all, center channel at all, but have it as a phantom stereo. So that when you're left and right, which is how you expect to hear it in the stereo track. If utilising the centre for vocal, recommended not to leave it dry. Vocal stems are delivered dry with effects separately. This opens opportunity to use the isolated effects in the immersive space. So again, we'll get into that a bit more. I don't think we need to look at the bottom one. This deck will be made available, by the way, so you can all take as much time as you want to have a look at it. Now, this is, I think, this is probably the most interesting slide on the whole deck, because the challenges really are here for how you apply this technology into different styles of music. So what I've done here is I've just listed a range of different styles and what I consider to be pretty good representations and examples of those styles done well in surround sound. First one, EDM electronica, Rufus Du Sol live at Joshua Tree. Really good recorded live by Cam Truan and mixed in this studio here early last year. So I'm flying the flag a little bit tongue in cheek, but it's a good mix and it's a good representation. And it's interesting because it's very early in our understanding. It was one of the first things we did in the studio in Atmos. So there was the vocal predominantly in the middle. So a couple of the things that we'll talk about, rules that we stick by now, we sort of broke. And the LFE was unashamedly used to boost the subs, which in this style I think works very well. Classical, I love the Nutcracker Suite by the Berlin Philharmonic. I think it's an incredible representation of surround, and particularly using headphones in binaural, it represents very, very well. Having said that, I spent a bunch more time today listening to classical. There are some absolutely exceptional classical recordings out there, particularly on the Apple platform, which I listen to mainly. Jazz, there's a new one just come out from Snarky Puppy called Empire Central. Another great act that does these fantastic live recordings where they put the audience inside the band. So they set up and they put the audience on chairs sitting inside where the band's playing. In this particular recording, 19 players and a live recording and mix at it was mixed in Fab DuPont's studio in New York, I think. Empire Central, really good recording, interesting one to listen to if you like jazz. Modern contemporary, I don't think there's a better recording than Taylor Swift Folklore, which was recorded with one of the guys from the National. What's his name? Aaron. Can't remember. There's not. Anyway, great recording done during a lot of it remotely, but during the COVID lockdowns. I think she's an exceptional songwriter, and this is a very, very good example of surround music recording and mixing. Heavy rock, heavy metal, I don't know. Grayscale, Lamb of God, about as good as it gets, I think. I don't listen to a lot of it. I think it's absolutely best represented with a big sound stage in stereo, left and right. I think that's, if you want to listen to that sort of music, that's to me how it should sound. But anyway, we can talk about that as well. And sync, look, there's so many incredible examples of this. Always hard to go past John Williams and Hans Zimmer. The new Obi-Wan track is really good. And I think Hans Zimmer, Message from an Old Friend, is also a really good track. But again, there's so much great stuff in sync. The Alan Meyerson recordings and mixes for Pirates of the Caribbean are exceptional as well. I don't know if anyone's seen them, but he did a 5-part series about mixing Pirates, and it's absolutely one of the best things I've ever seen. He's a genius as far as I'm concerned. Okay, that's all we've got in slides. So thank you I hope I didn't go too quickly and make too much of a mess of that, but you can see there's an enormous amount to cover in a fairly short amount of time. So I'll stop the share.
Thank you, Angus. Thank you.
Come back.
Now it's time for the audience to open the questions. We haven't got any other questions. You're going to do a production. You know that it's got to be in binaural. You know it's got to be in stereo. You know it's got to support 5.1. You're going up to the 10 formats and so on. How do you then balance those out between them? You do your production with a monitor in binaural stereo. You then do your mix. But when you get a different music genre in, how do you do that? And how good are these automatic rendering efforts?
Okay, so I think that the thing that I've found most interesting about mixing Dolby Atmos is the genres and how they change. So, for instance, the Rufus Du Sol recording that we mixed here, as I said, it was recorded live, very closely approximated the studio recording. A bit out of focus here for some reason. Let's try that. With obviously some of that live flavour that was missing on the original studio recording. But that style of music, EDM, really lends itself to a lot of movement. There's a lot of genres where if you start moving things around the 3D space too much, it sounds wrong. It sounds corny, it sounds cheesy, it sounds artificial, and it sounds unnecessary and frankly, quite often very irritating. So from that point of view, EDM, because it's obviously very rhythmic, it has a large bass component, and there's a lot of stuff already running from sequences and so on, lends itself perfectly to actually moving things around that stereo space. Now, how you do that and the degree to which you do that, that's the magic, and that's where the skill comes in, and that's where the artistic interpretation comes in making something that's not too outrageous, that doesn't sort of do your head in, but that has enough movement and that's sympathetic to the music in a way that enhances it rather than that detracts from the experience. So that's EDM. Now, if we go to the completely other end of the scale and to that heavy metal, heavy rock genre, I had a young guy working here for a while who's a heavy metal, guitarist and loved that style of stuff. And he played some stuff to me, and I couldn't at all reconcile that style of music being used in surround. And the very simple reason for it is that, having spent years and years as a live sound engineer and spending a lot of time at big concerts, there's something about sound coming from a big PA system or even a smaller PA system, but coming from the stage where you're seeing the artist, and the association with that power and that sort of grounded sound coming from a more two-dimensional space, if you like, where you've got the drums thumping out and the bass thumping out and the guitars, it's all coming from in front of you and hitting you like a wave. The minute I find that you start taking those really strident information and spreading it around and putting stuff behind you, for the most part, I find it really counterintuitive, and I don't find that it lends itself to the genre very well. Now, I did put that one example up where I think they've done it quite well, but they've done it very subtly. So they've not put a lot of information out the back. They've created ambience in the surround channels that support that front sort of stereo front image in a way that you would expect to hear in a venue, where you'd hear the reverberant and ambient sound coming back from walls and supporting that in a way that gives it more weight, rather than taking the weight away from the stereo image and placing it behind you in, as I say, a way that I've found not very convincing. Now, if we apply that same thought quickly to all those other genres, for instance, the Snarky Puppy recording done in a venue where the audience was actually sitting inside the band. So they were sitting on the stage with headphones on, which is the way those guys have recorded for a long time. You are in the middle of the recording, and you've got I think there was 3 drum kits or 3 drummers and percussionists. So you got, one drum kit at the front, which is that way, one at the back, percussion over here, guitars over there, brass over there, really using that 3D space to full effect. And in a great way that's very sympathetic to the live performance, but also to using it in a way that really does immerse you right in the middle of it. So again, interesting. Classical, I've heard a number of different applications where they tend to stretch the stage. So if you think about a typical classical stage, where you've got your first violins on house left or stage right, and then your seconds, and then you go around, to violas, cellos, bass, and then you've got your woodwinds behind in the middle, harp off to the left, percussion up the back. Some of these recordings will use the same kind of stereo sound stage that you would hear in a normal, like if you were at a gig. Other ones will actually stretch the strings around you, so you're more like being the conductor. Yeah. And then to a certain degree, they'll have the instruments above you, and then more probably ambience and room ambience behind. Now, there's that particular recording, the Berlin Philharmonic with the Nutcracker Suite, uses that technique where it's more like a conventional recording, and you're hearing the room behind you, which I really like. I think it works beautifully. Again, different applications. When you go to sync, you find that there's a lot more movement because it's working in a theatre, theatrical environment where they want to have more impact. They'll use the LFE a lot more for that intended purpose, for low frequency effect, and they'll use it with the music as well. But they'll utilize the 3D space a lot more for direct placement of instruments in the rears and the sides and the top speakers, which you wouldn't tend to find as often with a traditional classical recording, which has been released in Atmos. So is that?
Yes. Thanks, Angus. We got a question in from Damien Chai, talking about immersive. He's looking at his use of mixing and the problems he has with putting reverb on specific objects and then trying to get a consistent immersive effect that doesn't move with him.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a real challenge because there are some fantastic multi-channel reverb. For instance, I use the New Gen Paragon. I use the Isotope Symphony 3D and Stratus 3D, which are really excellent surround sound reverbs. But of course, they don't move. They don't move with the artist or with the movement because they're coming typically off a stereo input. So that's not giving you the three-dimensional information if you're panning a signal around. So that is difficult. You can use a function on the Paragon which decorrelates the input so that it will specifically, as you pan, it will follow where you're panning, which is really useful. The Paragon is a great reverb. I don't think its long reverbs are quite as good as its short ones because it's a convolution. But that is a real challenge. I tell you what I tend to do. There's a couple of things I do. There's a technique where I'll have a single send, but then I'll have three reverbs and I'll pan them to front, mid, and rear, so that and I'll then apply different parameters to those. So, for instance, the front reverb will be fairly short with a short pre-delay. The mid one will be slightly longer with a longer pre-delay, and then the rear one will be longer again with a longer pre-delay. So you'll get a signal hitting that reverb send, and then just spreading from front to back. So that gives some movement, and then depending on where you want that movement to go, you can obviously apply the panning or the placement of the returns, those reverb returns, to different parts of that 3D space. So I find that's a really, really useful reverb, great way to create movement quite subtly or quite dramatically, depending on how what you want to achieve. Now, there is another great tool by the Cargo Cult, which is another New Zealand company. They make an amazing auto panner called the Spanner, which is a 712 panner, and that can be used to feed reverbs or just to simply automate pans. And there's another product that they make called Slapper, which is a multi-channel, again, surround delay, which you can do all sorts of things with. It has reverbs as well.
Okay. Thanks, Angus. Damien, did that help?
I didn't actually see the question. I should have just gone down to it.
Damien's muted, which is fine. Do you find, Angus, that you need to set reverb parameters so you're getting a consistent acoustic space, or you're okay with having conflicting acoustic space images on the various performers?
It's a really good question, and it depends almost entirely on, again, the genre. So there are some things where I'm happy to have 3 or 4 different reverbs going that all do quite different things, but I'll often create 3 or 4 reverbs that will basically graduate in length. So I'll have one that's just an ambience, one that's perhaps a room, one that's a theatre or hall or a large plate. I tend to like plates because they're usually, if you get a good plate, they're usually very clean and clear, which is, I think, super important. But I think you'll find there was another contemporary artist, Billie Eilish, who I'm sure everyone knows. Her mixes in Atmos, I think, are really, really clever as well. And I think some of the best mixes I've heard often employ a really stark difference between dry and wet. And they'll have some components of the mix that are extremely dry, like bone dry, with no, they'll be near in the binaural field, they'll be near or off and have no reverb. And they'll be right in a particular space that sort of, buries, digs into your head there. And then a moment later, there'll be something that's really expansive and quite reverby. And the counterpoint between those, particularly in the 3D spaces, can be extraordinary when it's done well. It creates a really deep contrast. And when, as I say, when it's done well, that Billie Eilish album, what's it called? All of her stuff that's done in Atmos, I think, is very good. But that it's done to great effect on that album, particularly the dry stuff. A lot of vocals, discrete vocals in separate rear channels that you hear just underneath the main vocal, and incredibly evocative and quite psychoacoustically quite stimulating.
That's good. Thanks, Angus. Damien said thank you.
You're welcome.
Now I've just got a question in. Did you get that one, Angus, from Lloyd?
Which way am I going?
I can read it out to you if you need.
I don't see it, actually.
Well, what Lloyd Pearson is asking is, what amplifiers have been preferred to match with their speakers? So I assume he's talking about the speakers you use.
The KV2?
Yeah.
Okay, so the speakers in this studio are all EX series, which are self-powered. So they've got the amplifiers built into the box. Every speaker that KV2 makes has an amplifier that's specifically made to match that speaker. So if it's a 3-way speaker like an ESR 215, it'll have an ESR 3000, which is a 3-way amplifier that's specifically designed for that speaker. One of the great things about these speakers is that they're voiced almost exactly the same. So it doesn't matter what speaker you put up from KV2, they almost always sound exactly the same. And they're all designed to voice also extremely evenly from the quietest to the maximum, which is all to do with having the amplifiers all clipping at the same time. So George matches the power of the amplifier to the speaker to ensure that the dynamic response of the amplifier matches the speaker from minimum to maximum volume. So they're all KV2 amplifiers.
It's usually good to stop the speakers emitting smoke too.
Yes, indeed.
Now, somebody who's got their hand raised. I'm looking for the hand. Jim Barber has his hand raised and his hand symbol raised. Jim.
Great. I've just unmuted. Thank you, Angus. Look, it's been a fabulous presentation. I've got some questions. I'm setting up a small home production studio, 714 Logic Pro X with the Dolby Atmos renderer built in. I've got a couple of questions, but one is related to objects and beds. Within the Logic Pro format, there is only one bed that they're listing. I noticed also with the external Dolby Atmos renderer that there's the one bed, channels 1 to 10, and then the objects after that. Can you use multiple beds, in a stems type context? Obviously with music mixing rather than film mixing, but stems can still be used for a music context. How do they then render down to that one bed?
Yeah, okay, really good question. So there's one subject that I avoided talking about because it's just a can of worms. To answer your question directly, yes, Now, I'm not familiar with Logic, I'm afraid, and so I really can't speak to that. But I can tell you what we do in Pro Tools, which is to quite simply go into your I/O, and you can create another bed. So you can create 1, 2, 3, 4 beds, as many as you want. Obviously, given the fact that the more beds you use, the less objects you have available. But you can create multiple beds, which is what we do, obviously, in film and video, because we'll create dialogue, music and effects beds, and then often multiples of those. Now, there is another thing that you can do, which is called object beds. Now, this is becoming really, really popular in music, and I didn't mention it because mainly because my Pro Tools computer has died, and I wanted to be actually be able to show you how object beds work, but it's not something I can do just verbally because it's quite complex. But essentially, what you're doing is you're creating another bed, but instead of sending it to the conventional 712 bed, you're creating a bed using objects. And and you'll often find, if you monitor ADMs from people like particularly Steve Genowick, the guys at Nick Reeves and Steve Genowick at Capitol Studios in LA really are the leaders in this, and they're the guys that pioneered it. The other guy who's really incredible is Will Files, who's a great film mixer. But these object beds were created to be able to place objects wherever you wanted in the 3D space, and then apply a conventional LCR side rear kind of panning structure to the bed. So it means that you can essentially use your stereo panner, right, within Pro Tools or Logic, and then that applies then to an object bed rather than a conventional 712 bed. Now, I can't give you more information than that now because I'd have to show you. It's quite complex.
Yes, I was wondering in that context whether you could bring back reverb returns as objects rather than into a bed.
100%, yes.
Right. Okay.
Very much so. In fact, if you look at the Stratus and Symphony 3D, and I think also the Paragon, I can't remember offhand, the architecture of those is such that because you can only have a 712 bed, and these can do up to 914 reverb returns, you actually have to create stereo object outputs, and then you assign from within the plugin on the output of the plugin. You go to the I/O, and it'll actually point you to the front pair and the rear pair of the tops for the reverb returns. So to get your 4 top returns. So there's already quite a bit of architecture in place to deal with that. Now, I should also add that, well, you're on Logic. There's a couple of things. Apple, as I pointed out, made it really difficult for people using Pro Tools to be able to figure out what the hell was going on with their spatial rendering of the mixes that we were doing in 914, 714, whatever, because they didn't tell us how they were processing it. You can now take an output from Pro Tools internally, so using DVS or whatever, through to Logic, and then render out of Logic into your system, and get the actual Apple processing, right? So what it's going to sound like on Apple Spatial. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's just recently happened. And Pro Tools have just released an update that allows all sorts of very, very cool I/O stuff, and a new it's called the Avid Audio Bridge, which is like the Dolby Audio Bridge, which is what's used when you're running an internal renderer. Yeah. So that frees up HDX.
Logic, yeah.
Is that okay, Jim?
Logic, yeah. Yeah, and one last comment is with Apple Music, which I'm listening to through an Apple 4K box and a Samsung Q950.
There you go.
I'm often finding that choosing individual tracks, there's a silence. It's missing the first second or two of a track.
Yes.
Have you noticed that with Apple Playback? Yeah.
Yes. It's a rendering issue. Music. Yeah, it's a rendering issue. Right. Yeah.
At their end or at my end?
No, I think it's at our end. Because I have the same issue with the Arvis. Well, in which case it may be their end. Yeah, I know if you jump from one to another, quite often you lose the front. If you go back to the front of the song, you'll get it.
Yeah.
It's Rodney Staples speaking. It sounds as though the missing the first couple of seconds or first second of a segment is because of locking into video frames. And if you get a group of pictures, it will take the next keyframe and it will start with a still picture. So it's a frame related issue. And it's in a lot of video editors as well.
Does that help, Jim? He's nodding.
Thank you.
Thumbs up. That's good.
Thank you.
It's a very good point, I think. In fact, if I can just quickly look at that in there. Yep. It's not going to let me show it.
While you're doing that, I'm going to apologise for the pronunciation, but Vayab Aya has made some comments that are useful. Did you catch those? I apologise for that pronunciation.
I'm sorry, I haven't.
Right. Well,
I don't know if I'm getting this whole chat, to be honest. It doesn't. Oh, here we go. Logic does not have multiple bed support.
Yep, you got it.
While the renderer application does. Right. Okay. Well, that's it. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. I must admit, I haven't used Logic at all. The only thing I've done Atmos on is Pro Tools. And thank you for that. That's great.
Vayab might like to give us the pronunciation, please. Okay, that's good. What else? Are there any more questions generally about this? I'm getting the impression we've started on this. We haven't finished it. And there might be more opportunities for Angus to tolerate us. Oh, Jim.
I'm happy to go as long as you like.
One last question, if I may, please. And that is,
Sure,
if I produce something in my studio at home with Logic and want to bring it to you for a final mix, what format do I need to bring it to you if it's already got some Atmos rendering happening?
That's a really good question. Running Logic, how do we do that? I mean, typically, it's a tough one because I think probably the most common thing that people do. There's a couple actually. Look, let me just see if I can find this slide. No, I can't actually. There's a few different ways of doing it. One is to do a fully rendered multi-track version of your session. So commit all of your effects, processing, what have you, on each channel, and give me a Unity gain full rendered session, which I can import into Pro Tools, and that will then, that'll obviously have all of the metadata in terms of panning, and it'll have all of your processing in it. Typically, in that case, we'd also print separate, so print all your reverbs and so on with their spatial relationship. We haven't gone into this, but there's quite a few ways of presenting it. Stems are often done, and they're fraught quite often because, depending on what, how much detail is in the stems. If it's a keyboard stem and there's 10 keyboards, well, they're all going to end up being stereo somewhere in the field. What's worse is when you get vocals with, BVs with reverb on it, and it's like, well, wherever they're going to be, it's going to be a two-dimensional reverb, and that's that. So the more detail, the better. But also, if you're happy with what you've done mix-wise, the more that you can give me a standardized, committed, printed mix, the better.
Thank you.
There is a, I'll see if I can, I've got to talk to the guys at Universal, because there's a friend of mine gave me a copy of this document, and I've included a few bits here, but I don't want to make it available if it's not meant to be. So, but there is a very good section in that which just goes over that very question, and it's been couched far more eloquently than I have just now, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
Thanks, Angus. I've got David Roger was commenting further on the reverb and was stating that he saw the need for variable early reflections and reverb body for the 3D space. I don't know where he is.
Yep.
Yeah,
So-
I'm here if you'll let me speak.
Yeah, you're speaking.
Yeah, so I was just commenting on when after Damien asked his question about reverb, it occurred to me that, and I think, Angus, you might have said something already that addressed this, just, of course, immediately after I typed the question. So object location, is that available as a metadata that plugins could then use? So that if you had like a plugin that could vary the location, intensity of early reflections as opposed to reverb body, so that as the object moved around, you would expect the reverberant field to alter as well. If perchance one wanted to do something in that way, is object location metadata available and could be potentially used by a plugin?
Well, what's really interesting about that question is that's been happening within game audio for quite a while. Fmod, WYs, there's a bunch of plugins that are available on those platforms that allow you to do all sorts of automated audio effects relative to the exact on-screen image of the subject or whatever it is that you're applying that to. All sorts of really cool stuff. I don't know that much of that metadata is available for this application in these doors, because you've got to remember that these doors are functionally designed as stereo and then sort of have been expanded to include surround stuff as times allowed. I mean, originally it was 5.1 and then 7.1, 7.2, now Atmos. But they're not natively intended to do that. Although, having said that, I think Nuendo and Logic seem to have been more progressive in their implementation. So look, there may be some on those platforms. I'm not aware of any currently, other than the ones that I mentioned, the Halo, not Halo, Newgen Paragon. There are some others. There's another one called, I should have written it down. Cinematic Rooms, I think it's called. And that may well have some metadata variability. Hand on heart, I'm not sure. I'll look into it if I can find something out, and I'll pass it on to the group.
Okay. Thanks, Angus. Now, Gregory has jumped over to the clipping issue, especially when you're doing a binaural. And his question is there a risk to have clipping with a binaural rendering? Example for HRTF with a gain of greater than 1 for a given frequency if the signal is composed by that frequency.
Yeah, really good question. 100% yes, there is an issue there. So the number, the -18 and -1 true peak, relates to the Dolby Atmos, to the ADM level, so your multi-channel level. And yes, often we will run that for the binaural in order to make sure that that's at the correct level. So and you know what, I don't know, the Dolby guys may have some information on this, but info's been fairly thin on the ground. It was only just a couple of weeks ago that a new piece of software came out, which is called, no, I haven't got it here, have I? Of course. It's an album compiling software. So one of the biggest issues with Dolby Atmos over the journey, in particularly when we're talking about doing back catalogue. So if you're talking about, and I just had this experience, I did 2 Vance Joy albums, and the original mastering on the albums was incredibly compressed and really distorted, like kind of inexplicable to me. But anyway, and the brief for me was to recreate the feel of those stereo mixes. Well, when you've got dozens of channels, and you can't create you can't create your stereo masters using a bunch of really bespoke, mastering plugins or mastering hardware to get this compressed and EQ'd and slightly distorted, very, very kind of saturated sound. To try and replicate that in Dolby Atmos is really tough. It's really tough. It's very difficult. Now, just in the last, probably I'd say 2 or 3 weeks, month maybe, there has been released a piece of software that allows you to put your ADM in, which is the single file that has all of the object data, all the object metadata, plus your bed data and audio, and actually compress that and EQ that as a single file, and then compile that into a multi-file album format. So you can use it the same way I'd use something like Soundblade to compile a stereo album. So that's only just recently been released by Dolby. I haven't had a chance to use it yet because my computer died. So as soon as I get my new Mac Pro from the States, I'll be giving that a shot. But that's certainly, one of the big issues with this platform is trying to accurately and authentically reproduce an Atmos version of a famous stereo recording. Can be very tough, very tough. Did that answer the question?
Sorry, may I have another question?
Yes.
Rod Staples, who's talking now?
That was Damien, had another question.
Oh, right, okay. We'll take Damien and then Rod Staples.
Oh, okay, I appreciate it. So I want to know a little bit about when you have multiple microphone configurations, kind of recording classical or cinematic stuff, you have tree mics, gallery mics, or surround mics. How do you deal with that? Do you put those in the surround mix and put them in the bed, or can I creatively to put those as objects and put those in the space, like trees up there and surround back there, something like that?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely you can. In fact, Damien, if you just write, if you've got a pen there, there's a short film on Netflix called Sol Levante, Sollevante, and it's mixed by Will Files, who, as I mentioned him before, I think he's a genius actually, but he uses 3 object beds, and those object beds are actually utilized to process a variety of different orchestral elements. And the way he's done it is, if you imagine a 3D space, he's got the first bed is sort of like hard front, first quarter of the room, and then just past halfway in the room. And then the next object bed is sort of front, mid, back. And then the last object bed is sort of starts mid and then goes more heavily to the back and up into the highs, into the height speakers at the back. And he uses those to, in his mix to put different elements in, and it creates an extraordinary rich 3D space that you couldn't do any other way. You certainly couldn't do it with a conventional bed. And if you have a look at that, you can download the session and the video, and you can download all of the content. So if you've got a powerful enough computer, you can actually download that from Netflix and put it in. Are you using Pro Tools or?
I use Nuendo, but I got Pro Tools, so yeah.
Okay, you can probably do it in Nuendo. Yeah, it's really worth getting because it'll give you an extremely clear idea of what you can do with that. And yes, to answer your question simply, I think any of those multi microphone trees, Deca tree or whatever sort of format of multi mic setup you've got, it's absolutely fine to either look at how it's set up. So if it's set up in a Dolby Atmos, as in LCR heights, sides and rears, you could set that up in a conventional bed, or you could apply it to any kind of bed format that suits what you're trying to do and that sounds right. Because at the end of the day, you know, any kind of tree configuration behaves specifically to that, you know, to that format, and you need to find a translation of that in your room or in your binaural interpretation that suits the way that behaves. Now, there's another guy who I'd recommend if you're interested in following up on, a guy called Thomas Mitchell. He's at University in Newcastle. He, I think, is another genius, and he's done a lot of work with trees and with multi-mic setups, and has done some extraordinary recordings, some of which I've used in films I've done, and really, really clever guy. So Thomas Mitchell is his name, and he's a very, very nice guy and very, very skilled at multi-mic setups, and I would say he's probably one of the best in the world as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, actually, you're talking about the object beds. It's my first time hearing that. Like before that, I only think about, object is like things you can move around or something. But actually, like, I don't know if I understand correctly. It sounds like Dolby trees, the objects and the beds, I think maybe probably in a similar way. Like if I put the like 7.0.2 objects and just put it in the right position, it will sound like a 7.1.2, but only without RFE. Is that correct?
Exactly correct. Exactly correct. Yeah. So all you're doing is you're applying each microphone to an object, and then just keep moving those in the field until you feel like they're really doing what you want them to do, you know, sonically.
Cool. So like
that way you're not tied to a speaker. Yeah. You're not tied to a speaker. You have the freedom to move that microphone in three-dimensional space until you put it somewhere where it's telling the story you want it to tell.
So like objects, you can treat it like it's an like speaker array, but just without an RFE. Or like you can also treat it as like a microphone array.
Exactly. So it's the source goes to the three-dimensional data point that you decide it goes to, rather than being pointed directly to a speaker, which is obviously a fixed point, which is the reason why object beds are starting to be used so broadly in the music field. One interesting aside that I'll just expand on what we were talking about before. What I'm finding guys like Steve Genowick and some of these really major players in contemporary music mixing for spatial are doing now quite often is that they're almost ignoring the center speaker. So they're creating a stereo mix, a big stereo mix, left and right. They're creating a vocal with a phantom center, so there's nothing going into the center speaker. And then they're kind of pulling the mix out of that stereo into the surrounds to whatever degree is appropriate for the genre that they're mixing. So in some cases, it may be as simple as putting in multi-channel reverbs to create an ambience. There was a famous recording done by the guys there of a now it was either, I think it was Miles Davis or Parker. It was one of the early jazz guys, and what they did was they took the 2-track, they sent it to speakers and put speakers in the room, and each of the speakers they kind of treated to represent the instrument, so they EQ'd it to represent the instrument, and then remiked the room in an Atmos with an Atmos array. So it was basically just speakers in the room representing what the instruments were, and then remiked as Atmos. And I wish I could tell you exactly which one it was, but it sounds fantastic.
Cool. A lot. That's mind blowing for me. Really appreciate that. Thanks a lot.
No worries.
That helps you, Damien? Are you there? Yes. Okay. Now there's a comment from Jason Torrens. He's given us the details of where that Sol Levante can be obtained if you go to the chat. And
oh, wonderful.
And now,
thank you, Jason.
And Rod Staples had some comment on levels.
Yes,
Well, there he is.
it takes me right back to Sony DAT machine. There was an ISO and I think AES standard for digital audio back in 20, 25 years ago that set the reference levels effectively 0 VU in your analog system to -18 on your DAT machine. It was different on our TAC machine because they didn't follow the standard quite the same. The standard hadn't been resolved. And the -1 comes about because 0 is all bits on, and after that there is no headroom. So
correct. There's also interpeak. There's also interpeak overs as well. So
yes, and the headroom of some of the desks at the time was 20 dB above that 0 reference, but there was no such headroom available. It was 18 dB full stop in the DAT machine, and what they're doing is applying exactly that same standard, which is why your 0 and 1 dB is where it is.
Exactly, and it's interesting too because obviously this has just by default defeated the loudness wars, because all of this attempt to get everything up to a maximum and reduce the dynamic range to 0 so that, you know, I'm louder than you, it's gone away. And I think it's extraordinary because all of a sudden now, in fact, there are guys, I know there are guys mixing at -22, -23. There was an album done, Paul, what's his name? Paul Simon. I think his latest album was mixed at around -22, -23. And it's inexplicable, but it's just, it opens the music up so much because there's dynamic range again. And, you know, we lost dynamic range for years and years where everything just hit 0 and stayed there, you know, and apart from the intersample peaks, which got you into trouble with, you know, Apple.
You could do that with 24-bit or 32-bit audio, but 16-bit audio you can't do that with.
No, not at all.
You couldn't. Past tense.
Past, yeah. So anyway, I think that's one of the great sort of coincidences, or not coincidence, one of the happy accidents of Dolby Atmos, you know, mastering, is that it, and, you know, people go, oh, it's not loud enough. I'm like, well, turn it up. Turn it up. You got a volume control, turn it up.
Or you tell them they're going deaf.
Sorry?
Or you tell them they're going deaf.
Oh, sorry.
Questions? Big opportunity here. Any more questions?
Rick Curtin had a question about getting a link to the Dolby spreadsheet.
Oh, yes, yeah, I sent him an answer to that, but if he wants to, he could contact you at Red Road, couldn't he, Angus? If he wants that.
Sure. I'll make that available.
Put it up on our website. That'd be
to you guys. Yeah. Look, I have to say, Dolby have an extraordinary library of support material online. You can go there and join the customer or the professional. There's a whole range of different areas where they distribute information, and they're very, very comprehensive in the detail and amount of information they have available. And I thoroughly recommend spending some time on there, because I'll be honest with you, I read it all a long time ago and I've forgotten probably most of it, but they have a lot of information there, and they cover pretty much every aspect of Dolby Atmos for music, and obviously for film and video as well. But it's a great resource. I mean, I thoroughly recommend it. They've been fantastic in what they've accrued and made available to people.
Good. Well, there being no more questions. Okay, well, on behalf of the committee and of the section and section members here in Melbourne, I'd really like to thank you, Angus. It's been most informative. I didn't see anybody falling asleep.
Oh.
There were lots of, I think there's more questions to come, so you might find there's a few more, and maybe another session at some stage on some aspects of that. But I certainly want to thank you. I'll just make it known that there'll be a summary of the session and material relating to tonight available on the website when we can cut through all of that and make it online. So I want to thank you, Angus. We usually have a small token of esteem for presenters, and it doesn't travel well over the internet. So I might have to come and visit you at some stage. But anyway, I'd like now to find your unmute buttons, which takes a bit of time. And then I'd like you all to join with me in certainly thanking Angus for all of, oh, hang on. Graham, have you put your hand up?
No, I meant to say.
Oh, good. Okay, I'd like to thank Angus.
No, I meant to say thank you. That's a clap.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Thank you, Angus. Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.